Welcome to Wonderland, the podcast where I go down the rabbit hole to research things you may be curious about. My name is Ami, and I'll be your guide on this trip to Wonderland. Hi there, my Wonderlings. I've been busy, and I know it's been a while since our last visit down the rabbit hole, but I promise I have some fun things planned for the rest of this year. One of the things I was busy with was the 2024 Soda City Comic-Con. I tagged along with the All About Nothing guys again this year for 2 live recordings of the All About Nothing podcast with Soda City Comic-Con staff. Additionally, some of the staff, the All About Nothing guys, and I worked the Columbia Fireflies game, getting people hyped up for the con. And finally, I spent 2 full days at the Columbia Metropolitan Center for the 2024 Soda City Comic-Con at the All About Nothing and Nerdy by Nature table. I thought since I was spending so much time in the world of Comic-Con, that a Comic-Con episode was in order. But if you're a longtime listener, you know I already did that for last year's episode 19. I thought this year, instead of asking folks to answer questions about Comic-Con, I'd ask them what they wondered about. And that's exactly what we're doing this episode.
I wonder.
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 So join me as we go down the rabbit hole of comic conventions. Again. Our first question is from Michael with the Nerdy by Nature YouTube channel. Nerdy by Nature consists of Michael and Leroy, and they discuss video games, comic books, movies, and everything that tickles your nerdy fancy. Michael and Leroy are also featured on episode 19, Comic Conventions.
Well, I mean, that's really easy. That is, a comic convention is just a nerd wonderland, really.
So, what was Michael wondering?
You put me on the spot, and now I don't know. Trying to find a good question. Okay, the basic one is just, how did Comic-Cons get started in the first place?
Okay.
Yeah.
I can do that.
Okay, Michael, I actually did answer this back in the older episode, and you can listen to that episode for more details. But the first comic convention was held in New York City in 1964 and was called New York Comic Con. This convention had around 100 attendees. The idea was taken from science fiction conventions, which had been taking place for 3 decades when the first comic convention occurred. The founder of the 1964 New York Comic Con wanted a place where lovers of comics could come together to buy and trade comics, complete their collections, and get to discuss their common love for comics. The most well-known comic convention is probably San Diego Comic-Con, which started in 1970. Be sure to listen to my previous episode for more information on what led up to comic conventions and how they grew. The next question is from a different Michael, the one I'm married to.
What's something you wondered about Comic-Cons?
I wonder when cosplay came into the mix, when that started and started being part of the Comic-Cons.
I know he listened to the old episode, and I share some fun information on cosplay in that one, but costume roleplay, or cosplay, is a performance art where participants wear costumes and accessories to represent characters. Much like the idea to do comic conventions was borrowed from science fiction conventions, so too was the concept of dressing up for the convention in costume. Costumes were worn at the first World Science Fiction Convention in New York City in 1939. While the earliest comic conventions around the world likely did not have many participants who dressed in costume, it's possible that the first costume contest at a comic book convention was the first Academy Con, which was held at Broadway Central Hotel in New York in August 1965. In 1974, San Diego Comic-Con held its first masquerade ball and contest, with first place going to future Scream Queen Frank Stevens, who was wearing a Vampirella costume. Since then, cosplay has become a pretty standard part of any comic convention, with costumes varying from very basic to grandiose, homemade to store-bought, and well-known characters to completely original characters, or OCs. Check out www.wtwlpod.com for pictures of folks in cosplay from the 2024 Soda City Comic-Con. The next question came from Bill, who has spent his summer working as an intern producer for the All About Nothing podcast. Let's hear what Bill was wondering about.
So, we're here at Comic-Con. What is something that you have always wondered about Comic-Con, comic culture, cosplay, anything like that?
Probably the process of putting all of this together. Like, there's just a lot of stuff going on all the time, and like then there's celebrities that just slowly accumulate throughout the year. Like, I don't know how you would go through that process, so it'd be cool to hear more about that.
Oh boy, Bill, that's a great question. And honestly, I'm going to borrow some audio from one of our favorite podcasts, The All About Nothing. Barrett and Zach have had several opportunities over the past 2 years to talk to Donald Brock and other members of the Soda City Comic-Con staff. and this is definitely something they've discussed. So take a trip with me to an alternate podcast, and listen to what an actual comic convention producer has to say on the matter.
All right, please welcome our guests. We have Brock and Amy from Columbia Comics.
Welcome.
They are the organizers of the 2023 Soda City Comic Con, and thanks for being here.
Thanks a lot. Yeah,
thanks for having us.
Thank you.
We're very excited to have you here. So for this year though, we got Sean Astin.
Yep.
Christina Ricci's on the bill right now.
Yep. She is.
And we've also got Vanessa Angel, and then a slew of voice actors.
Yep.
What does it generally take to get actors of that caliber that have that type of genre in their background?
Yeah, what's that process going to find someone?
It's not as hard as you would think.
Okay. Agents?
Yes, there are agents. A lot of times, I don't want to come across as sounding arrogant or pompous.
No, do it. We do it all the time.
Well,
Especially.
but
Yeah.
I feel like you've made it when you've got vendors at New York Comic Con saying, hey, there's a show in South Carolina called Soda City Comic Con. And the other guy goes, oh, yeah, I've heard of that. When your event is a discussion point on the floor of New York Comic Con, I feel like you've made it, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, absolutely.
So a lot of it is people reaching out to us.
Gotcha.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So from that standpoint, a lot of the legwork is done by the agents. They'll say, hey, I saw your event, or I heard about your event, or we saw content on YouTube. So, people will reach out to us and say, hey, saw your show, read about your show, da-da-da. And I've got this list of clients. And we'll go through it, and it'll be, we'll go through a list of, there'll be 40 people on the list.
How it works. Yeah. It's cool because Steve knows all the horror stuff.
Steve knows a lot about horror.
Most of the comic and anime, and I do
we
pop
watch
culture
anime.
and sci-fi.
Honestly, there are 4 or 5 different episodes with Donald Brock where the guys discuss comic conventions and what goes into it. So when you're done with this episode, flip on over to the All About Nothing podcast and listen to episodes 165, 210, 214, and 221 to get more behind-the-scenes information on what goes into making a comic convention. And speaking of the All About Nothing podcast, this next question comes from Barrett, one of the show's hosts. What did Barrett wonder?
All right, Barrett, what is something you've always wondered about Comic-Con or cosplay, comic-related culture, any of it?
I think one of the things I'm curious about is just the amount of travel that some people do for some of these Comic-Cons, because they have them all over the country. And people literally will follow Comic-Cons from one city to the next. I'm curious as to how someone decides that that's what they want to do. Or just that thought process of this is what I do. I go from one Comic-Con to the next, and it's just amazing to me.
For this one, I reached out to TikTok and asked for stories about traveling for comic conventions. Unfortunately, as of the time of this recording of this episode, I don't have any to share, so be sure to keep an eye on TikTok to hear more on this. And thank you to anyone who helps answer this question for Barrett. Next up, we have Zach, also from the All About Nothing podcast.
All right, Zach, what's something that you have always wondered about Comic-Con?
I always wondered, when did the Comic Code Authority go away?
Thanks, Zach, for this question. Before we can talk about when the Comic Code Authority went away, I think we need to at least talk a little about what the CCA is. In an attempt to prevent government regulation, the Comics Magazine Association of America formed the Comics Code Authority, also just called CCA or the Comics Code, in 1954. The Comics Magazine Association of America, CMAA, was formed in September of 1954 as a response to rampant public concern regarding the sometimes violent or horrifying imagery in comic books. The CMAA was headed up by a juvenile delinquency specialist, Charles F. Murphy, who devised a self-policing code of ethics and standards for the comics book industry. The code was based on a code drafted by the Association of Comics Magazine Publishers in 1948. Technically, the CCA didn't have any official control over comics publishers, but nearly all distributors refused to carry any comics without the seal. Some of the things in the 1954 code included, quote, "Crime shall never be presented in such a way as to create sympathy for the criminal, to promote distrust of the force of law and justice,
or to inspire others with desire to imitate criminals, along with, in every instance, good shall triumph over evil and the criminal punished for his misdeeds. In addition to pieces relating to morality, the code also indicated that scenes dealing with or instruments associated with Walking Dead, torture, vampires and vampirism, ghouls, cannibalism, and werewolfism are prohibited. Think of some of the most popular comics these days, where sometimes sympathy is created for the villain, and vampires and zombies aren't unusual at all. Comics such as these would be unable to obtain the CCA seal. Some comic publishers updated their content to get the seal, while others had to cancel certain titles, and still more just went out of business. The code was updated in 1971 to allow for, amongst other things, the, quote, sometimes sympathetic depiction of criminal behavior and corruption among public officials, as long as it is portrayed as exceptional and the culprit was punished. Due to the literary works like Dracula and Frankenstein being read in public schools, the revamped code also allowed for vampires, ghouls, and werewolves, when they were handled in the classic tradition of works like Dracula and Frankenstein. Zombies, lacking any classic literary predecessors, were still banned. Additionally, several topics remained taboo even with the updated code, but the code still remained almost required, if not by law, in practice. So now that we understand what the CCA is, let's go back to Zach's question.
When did the Comic Code Authority go away?
The answer is 2011. But really, publishers started just publishing without the seal in the 1980s and 90s, including DC's Watchmen and The Dark Knight Returns, both in 1986, which were never even submitted for the seal. In 2001, the CCA rejected an issue of Marvel Comics series X-Force and required changes. Instead of making any changes, Marvel simply just stopped submitting its comics to the CCA. By 2010, Bongo Comics broke with the CCA. Then on January 20th, 2011, DC Comics announced that they were no longer going to use the CCA and were instead adopting a rating system similar to Marvel's. The final publisher still using the seal, Archie Comics, followed suit the next day, rendering the Comics Code Authority defunct on January 21st, 2011. So this brings us to the last question that was posed to me at the 2024 Soda City Comic Con, and maybe the most fun question. This one comes from Leroy, the second half of Nerdy by Nature. What was Leroy wondering?
I got it.
You got it?
Yep.
Okay, so you come to a lot of Comic Cons. You're very ingrained in nerd culture. What's something you've always wondered about Comic Con?
What is the weirdest Comic Con or the weirdest convention? Like, what is the weirdest kind of convention where people who like something that's so niche that you're like, that's a convention? Like, is there like a catch-up convention? Or like like, what does that look like?
Oh my God, that's an excellent question. I can't wait to find out.
Like, I know that there's like a convention of like corgis or something like that where people like, there's the Westminster and all that stuff. But what's the weirdest convention out there that you're just like, what is that?
I can't wait to find out. Thanks, Leroy.
So according to a 2015 Business Insider article, there are approximately 1.8 million conventions, conferences, and trade shows in the United States each year. The article pulled heavily from a project that photographer Arthur Drucker spent several years investigating. Drucker avoided common events like comic conventions and Star Trek conventions and instead visited conventions such as the Lincoln Convention, which was an event in Columbus, Ohio, where more than 150 people dressed up as Abraham Lincoln. Drucker also attended Merfest, which is a festival in North Carolina dedicated to merfolk, where attendees dress up with fishtails and spend the event in water, and even includes mer weddings. Exiting this article and continuing my digging through the rabbit hole, I found a convention for paper dolls in Missouri. In Orlando, there's a convention specifically for celebrity impersonators. This one includes classes on how to be a better impersonator and potentially puts you in contact with talent agents. Still in Florida, there's an event called the Florida-Bama Mullet Toss. And I know I said Florida, so you're probably thinking hair, but no, this is literally an event where hundreds of people show up to see who can throw one of thousands of dead mullet fish the furthest. The event has live bands on 5 stages and special dining from local restaurants. Going back to North Carolina, you can attend the Great Outhouse Races in February, which appears to be skiing while in an outhouse. If you really love Shrek, you can visit Madison, Wisconsin in July for their annual Shrek Fest. Honestly, there are so many strange conventions. Spam Jam in Hawaii celebrating the canned meat. A convention for Santa Clauses, but only if they have a real beard. Conventions for twins, one for redheads. Essentially, if it's something that there might be a shared interest in, it's probably out there. And because Leroy asked about a ketchup convention, I'm sad to say that he missed the 2024 festival in Collinsville, Illinois, that boasts the world's largest ketchup bottle, and also welcomed the world's largest potato this year. Maybe next year, Leroy. Well, that's all I have today, my Wonderlings. If you haven't listened to the previous Comic Conventions episode, give it a listen. Then pop on over to the All About Nothing to check out their Comic-Con episodes. And since we're plugging nerdy content right now, don't forget to stop by Nerdy by Nature Productions on YouTube and Facebook for tons of nerd content. I know I said at the beginning of this episode that I have some fun things in the works, and I do. So please be patient with me as I work to get the rest of the episodes for this year on the books, including some with guests. What rabbit holes are you hoping we might be going down soon? Let me know on Facebook, X, Instagram, TikTok, email, www.wtwlpod.com, in person, wherever. I'd love to hear your feedback. Until next time, be safe, be kind, and stay curious. The Welcome to Wonderland podcast is copyrighted by Ami Bland and is part of Big Media. This podcast was recorded in the Welcome to Wonderland recording closet, which is also where I keep my clothes and shoes. And I love some clothes and shoes. It's a tight fit in here, friends, but I love you enough to endure. Any thoughts or opinions expressed as part of this production are those of the hostess unless otherwise indicated. Subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcast. Please follow, like, and share this podcast. Find us on Facebook at Welcome to Wonderland the Podcast, and on X, the app formerly known as Twitter, at WelcomeLand_pod. Check out behind-the-scenes moments and other videos on TikTok at Wonderland Pod, and finally check out pictures, additional information, and go further down the rabbit hole or pick up Welcome to Wonderland merchandise on our website at www.wtwlpod.com. To submit corrections, additional information, or requests for episodes, please email the host at welcometowonderlandthepod@gmail.com. Oh my God, so out of practice. I don't even remember how to stop. Stop.
The preceding podcast is a product of Big Media and copyright 2024, all rights reserved.